Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about randomness in games. This is a question from Salute the Captain, who said, I was surprised to not find a video on randomness as a general mechanic on your channel. What are your thoughts on balancing out everything is too static and this feels unfair, weird, random complaints? So I did talk about how I've gone about in the past implementing features that used randomness, and I'll link that video below. The one thing that came out of it that I could not stress highly enough in that video was that other game developers are terrible at what they mean by randomness. They will say randomness. That word will come out of their mouth repeatedly, even though I push back and I'm like, that's not exactly what you want. And I try to explain to them what they want. They know I want it random. Turns out they don't want random. They want fairness and uniformity and cyclic behavior. Watch the video if you want to know what I mean, but I can't tell you how many times in my career I've had some game developer from design, art, music come up to me asking for randomness, and they did not want randomness. But I also covered using random ranges in my second part of damage numbers. The first part, damage numbers, is about how they appear in the HUD. There's a damage numbers part 2, which talks about damage ranges. So watch that if that's what you're interested in. Let's talk right now about why you might even want randomness in your game. Randomness makes things vary, makes things unpredictable, adds a replayable element to your game. You may want that on determining if an attack hits. You may want to put it in the range of damage an attack does, so that not every attack is guaranteed to be identical to a previous attack. You may want some of your skills to have a random success. Lockpicking is a common one. You walk up to a lock, it says you have a 60% chance of picking it. If you pick it, it opens. If you don't pick it, your lockpick breaks. Boom. Perfect example of, hey, the more skilled you get, the less lockpicks you go through and the more locks you open. Random encounters is another perfect place to have randomness. When people are going across the world map, they have a chance of running into something. It's not always the same thing. You don't hand place things on the map. It's just they happen to run into bugbears or they happen to run into a deathclaw. That just happens on your world map. Similarly, if they kill those things or they kill anything you put in, frequently, not always, but frequently, loot is randomized, especially on random encounters. But more than often, like non-boss encounters have random loot, because what you really want to do is just give the player, here's a bunch of loot that can drop in this level or this level range for the player's level range. Here's some loot for you. Similarly, we often use tables for driving merchant inventory. So merchants don't always have the exact same items in stock. It's randomized from a list of what their inventory can contain. These are all good uses of randomness, and a lot of games use that exact thing for their randomness. However, randomness like that exists in tension with save games, particularly games that let you save anywhere. I have a video on loading and saving and all the different ways you can do saving in different spots and restricting save games of the player. Please watch that if you want to know more details on loading and saving. But in general, what it means is a lot of gamers will simply, if they encounter randomness, they will simply reload until they get the result they want. The reason randomness works in some games and not others is from two things. One, some games restrict where they use randomness, and other games restrict where save games are allowed. So let's dive into both of those to see why randomness is still used in games that have save games. First of all, restricted randomness. Restricted randomness, I mentioned like you may roll to hit and then you roll for a damage range. You don't always have to do that. You could just say you always hit and the damage is in a random range. This is exactly what the Outer Worlds did with melee attacks. If you're facing the thing and it's within range of your melee weapon, your melee attack always hits. But your skill determines how much damage you can do. Another restricted randomness is that merchants don't refresh very frequently. They may refresh every week or every few days after the player comes by. So the player just can't sit there and let time pass. They have to visit the merchant and look through their stuff. And then they see that there are other people there shopping and maybe it makes sense on why it refreshes. Similarly, you can have restricted save. And I'll talk in a minute about a 100% restriction of randomness by getting rid of it. But let's jump into restricted saves really quickly. I discussed that in my save load vid, like I said. But if saving is restricted to the start of a map, or only when the player goes somewhere that they can sleep or camp, then randomness in lots of places works better because the player will have to go back quite a bit to a previous save game to get back to where the randomness comes in. But if people can save anytime they want, anywhere they want, randomness is far less useful because people will just walk up to a door, save, pick, break a lockpick, reload, pick, break a lockpick, reload, pick, it worked, yay, keep going, save, keep going. That's what I mean by the tension between randomness and save anywhere. The more randomness you use, the less likely you should probably allow people to save anywhere, and vice versa. Now, there are alternatives, like I mentioned, to doing randomness. One of them is pre-rolling random numbers. For example, you could have the next 10, 20, 100 skill rolls saved on that player character. They're generated when the character is, and you walk down those, that list. Arcanum did this for skills. It saved, I think, just the next skill roll in the player character, whatever skill roll was used. The problem with doing this is once players learn that's what you're doing, they will simply, like, let's say they want to pick a lock. They will do something else that uses a skill roll, like maybe shoot with a ranged weapon at some inanimate object that won't trigger combat. That uses up the random roll for their ranged attack. They get a new roll and they try to pick the lock. If it doesn't work, they reload. Range attack, pick. Range attack, pick. You can do that. Even if you have a pre-rolled for every skill, maybe they're find a lock in the game they don't care about. Reload, pick that lock, which generates a new number for the next roll, and then they go to the lock they care about. Yes, it requires a little more work. Some people will do that work and be bored by it and get mad at you for making them do that work. So I'd avoid doing this if you think that's the kind of game you're going to have. You can also have random seeds where you just store the seed for an entire random number generator. If you want to know how to do this, look up linear congruential generators. They always start with a seed. Arcanum did this for chest loot, and used the player's name as the seed for the loot generator, random number congruential generator. What's cute about this is I loved it because it made everything you made about your character matter, including your name. I also did this in the GURPS star system generator, and you can see this in a video I have on GURPS apps. I'll link it below. It created and stored an entire galactic sector with just 4 bytes because it just stored the seed that it used to generate that sector. By storing those 4 bytes, that gave me 2 to the 32nd power of galactic sectors, which is about 4 billion. So you were unlikely to see a repeat, even if you ran the generator 100 times. So those are forms of randomness you can use, but instead of using any randomness at all, you can instead base things on player stats. Maybe things happen in the game because the player has a certain attribute at a minimum level, like luck. Random encounters in Fallout did this. Or maybe their skill is a certain level. Maybe if your stealth is a certain level, you can do something. It's just automatic. You can just always go in this way and no one will see you. The event may not be called out, and it may not even say what unlocked it, what made it possible to work. So maybe eventually players will figure this out and share it online. But it's cool because it's not random. But not every player character can do it. You can also do something similar, but instead of player stats, you can choose player behavior. Maybe killing a particular person or stealing a particular item or choosing a particular line in a dialogue sets a trigger for an event to happen the next day or the next week or the next month. It may seem random to a lot of players, but you may even eventually reveal what it was. And then, of course, when people replay, they're always like, oh, you have to kill this person or not, or you have to steal this thing or not. But it introduces that kind of, I had a different playthrough than my friend. Well, that's because you did different things and that caused different stuff to happen. Similarly, you can just use timers to do that. You can have a thing that happens every n seconds in the game. The randomness will come not from how often the event happens, but when the player happens along to encounter it. The player may wander into a town and the event may happen 5 seconds later. Or he may wander into the town and the event doesn't happen for 5,000 seconds because where they are in the timer tick down. Since the player, you don't control what the player does, they're kind of an interesting source of randomness in the game if you do things like that. And of course, one way of getting rid of randomness altogether is to replace everything in the game that has randomness and replace it with a mini game. This is commonly done in a lot of games with like lockpicking or hacking. There's a mini game that the player plays, and then if they succeed, they pick the lock or break into the computer. Because they want this to depend on the character skill, they frequently make the mini game easier if the player has a higher skill, or harder if they have a lower skill. But it still often comes down to the player's skill as well. And that's one reason, like, mini games for me is always a mixed bag, because my character may have a perfect score in lockpicking, but if I'm terrible at the lockpicking mini game, my player character isn't that good at it, and it has nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. And that's where sometimes I feel like we need to divorce the player from the character in an RPG. In any case, that's sort of my thoughts on how to introduce randomness into role-playing games. It makes the game less predictable and therefore more replayable. But depending on the player, that can be good or bad. Some people may not want that unpredictability. They may not care about replayability. So use randomness how fits your game well, fits the kind of skills and challenges you're going to throw against the player. And also, don't forget to keep in mind how your save games work. Anyway, those are my thoughts on randomness in games. I hope that answers your question. Salute the captain.